This is the prelude of video series, End of History, How Neo-totalitarianism Will Take Over US in 30 Years. Let me begin with the question, what is the end of history? This phrase is of course not an original one, but came from Hegel and then Karl Marx, and most recently from Fukuyama of his book, End of History and the Lost Man, published in 1992. Right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. All these great philosophers have been trying to understand the human history as a directional and evolving process, but from different angles. As we all know, while using dialectics from Hegel, Marx kept himself at a distance by claiming himself as a materialist and used his materialist dialectics to analyze the history and believed in the end of history is communism, where the human needs is satisfied by abundance of products. Fukuyama naturally rejected Marx's view of end of history after witnessing the failure of socialism from generating abundance of commodities, but instead famine and terror. He seems to agree more from Hegel's view and believed that, quote, the liberal democracy has since lost its only worthy competitor, and now the history has ended right before us, unquote. Fukuyama has painted an optimistic view of history after the end of Cold War, and the result has certainly favored the liberal democracy system. In fact, he didn't deny that history may suffer temporary rollbacks, and democracy may not be stable and self-sustainable in the Third World, such as Russia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America. He claimed that, even when the fallback happens, it does not mean that there is a new system that can challenge the liberal democracy. He wrote, quote, communism, which had once portrayed itself as a higher and more advanced form of civilization than liberal democracy, would henceforth be associated with a high degree of political and economic backwardness. It has ceased to reflect a dynamic and appealing idea. The ideological threat that once posed to liberal democracy is finished, and with the withdrawal of the Red Army from Eastern Europe, much of the military threat will be gone as well, unquote. All of these philosophers, Hegel, Marx, and Fukuyama, who believed in universal history, lived within the same Western world. Hegel lived through the unfolding French Revolution and the ratification of the US Constitution. And the Industrial Revolution has given Marx and Engels a lot of inspiration for their materialism. The society in the West has evolved from slavery to monarchy and feudalism, then to capitalism. It's so tempting to think what happened to represent a cosmopolitan rule that will get every state through the history. If you look beyond to other parts of the world, different governments and civilizations do exist, such as Africa, Middle East, South Asia, and Latin America. There are still many countries ranging from authoritarianism, theocracies. That does not follow the paradigm. These states are usually briefly mentioned in these optimistic end-of-history prophecies, if at all, and usually dismissed as abnormality due to specific cultural and geographic conditions. The models can't explain whether these states will be magically upheaved into liberal democracy or they will stay there for eternity. The whole Western political philosophy needs a perspective from outside of the system, and this is the reason why I created these lectures. As an outsider, it's easy to see the liberal democracy, while so naturally and destined from a Westerner's eyes, can be just a series of fragile historical contingencies. The liberal democracy is not a stable system. We can see this from a series of rollbacks in Latin America and Asia. And 30 years after the collapse of Soviet Union, Russia is still not included in the democracy arena. United States has been blessed by God. This is by no means an exaggeration. On the other hand, monarchism has been dominating China for over 2,000 years. Revolutions broke out every couple of hundred of years that overturns the previous one, but was never able to evolve into democracy. And with the recent Sino-US trade war and the increasing military tension in South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, There's no sign the Chinese government that has controlled all aspects of people's life is going to give out their power. The directional history evolution believed by these philosophers may not be universal at all. The second reason I created these lectures is that I fundamentally disagree with any of these prophecies about our future. Mr. Fukuyama, in his book, drew his conclusion, quote, "Human history is directional and can be formulated into a universal history pattern, and the end of history is liberal democracy," unquote. The world is undergoing abundance of changes and turmoil in the past decades right before our eyes. At one side, the globalization had similarly increased human cooperation, and commodity has been greatly enriched. At the other side, the wealth gap of the West and the East within the United States itself widened greatly. The improved productivity does not improve the world as it should have, which has given rise to immigration crisis, nationalism, trade wars, and regional conflicts. Our first conclusion is there is not a universal history as depicted by Karl Marx and Fukuyama. From the information technology side, personal computer, internet, iPhone, social networks, and most recently self-driving cars, AI, and digital currency, the iteration of technologies are getting faster. The coronavirus pandemic and global lockdown really shifted human behavior and enterprises in such a short period of time. New technology will greatly increase the productivity and deeply affect the economic and social structure, and then in turn affect the political institution. Our second conclusion is that neo-totalitarianism instead of liberal democracy will be the future of the US and the world. Fukuyama's era is trying to predicate the defeat of Marxism by the collapse of the Soviet Union. This argument fell apart when first, Russia is not going to liberal democracy anytime soon. Secondly, the socialist China continues to thrive and its GDP is now inching closer to US from behind. It also can't answer the question why multiple socialism regimes still exist and expanding. China, North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam. The Belt and Road Initiative of Socialist China aims to increase the influence of socialist country. The recent election victory of the leftist candidate in Chile also exemplified this. Marxism and communism will not vanish just yet, not because it is correct or people have forgotten the backwardness and terror of the socialist regimes. Marxism arouse two demons deep inside the human's innate desires. First, take from the rich people for free, and second, violent and bloody struggle. Fukuyama's error is to think the enemy of liberal democracy is coming from outside, and fail to look within. After all, the real deciding factor of the political institution will be decided by the economic structure. The allies and admirers of neo-totalitarianism can be found in Wall Street, enterprises, and the US government. Fukuyama's error is underestimating the impact of today's technology change. In fact, it is quite courageous to claim end of history. The Earth has already existed 4.5 billion years, while human history is only a few thousands of years. And modern technology has existed no more than 200 years. We are like a newborn to human history. Nowadays, it's hard to predict technology development in next 5 years. How can it be possible to predict what it is like thousands or even millions of years later? Fukuyama's optimism can be explained by the concept of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism is the idea that the United States is inherently different from other nations. The values, political systems, and historical development of the US are unique in human history, often with the implication that the country is both destined and entitled to play a distinct and positive role on the world stage. This US traditional value is based on liberty, equality before the law, individual responsibility, republicanism, representative democracy, and free market. As we know about history, nothing is constant. You can never step into the same river twice. People can sense the shrinking liberty we're having. US political system is degenerating, and US people are suffering, falling down as a God-blessed country. Quantitative changes will inevitably lead to qualitative changes. The political spectrum is more and more polarized in US and around the world. It's harder for the left and right to see eye to eye on a lot of social and political issues. This lecture series hopes to meet the gap by unifying both sides with one common enemy and one shared value. The common enemy that's facing both the left and right is neo-totalitarianism. Socialism did not originate in Germany. It was in Germany that they were perfected and culminated during the last quarter of the 19th century. German Nazism, Soviet Union Stalinism, and their cousin Maoism in China are the fruits of the socialism theories. These socialisms may take different forms, but there are so many commonalities among them. Their failures did not mean the end of threat to the liberal democracies in Western world. Actually, both Soviet Union and China has evolved into another fearful monster that is neither liberal nor democratic. In this study, we regard neo-totalitarianism as the China model after the 1978 economic reform, which features one-party leadership, socialist market economy or state capitalism, state propaganda machine, citizen censorship, and limited pluralism in non-political areas, and so on. China has become more and more a threat to US and democratic world, not only by its strong military presence, lack of environmental responsibility and human rights, and national capitalism gave it advantage to steal jobs from liberal world. Chinese global propaganda machine sends lies and transfers corruptions to the liberal democracy institutions. The neo-totalitarianism differs only slightly from the Nazis and the Marxist socialism. The demon has never left. It just changed shape. The totalitarianism of Marxist socialism has failed as a viable option in USSR and Maoist China. Yet the materialist dialectics and dialectics history theory of Marx and Engels have not been thoroughly scrutinized and refuted. The End of History by Fukuyama has done a great job in covering a wide variety of topics and denied the communism as the end of history. But he didn't refute the obvious errors in Marxism and the so-called scientific socialism in philosophical terms, as he probably thought there is no longer need to do so after the collapse of USSR. There is actually a shared value between left and right, liberal and conservatives alike: liberty. Without liberty, a liberal can't be called a liberal. We will have a dedicated chapter to discuss in detail what the liberty truly means. It has been the center of Western civilization based on Christianity, but it has been overlooked for so long. This is the single most important value in the Western civilization that sparks the technology creations and advance in science. Liberty also means man's natural needs are satisfied first and foremost. As Fukuyama has it, quote, "A hungry and cold man seeking to satisfy his natural needs for food and shelter is no more free than a bear," unquote. In current US politics, we the people are looking at a lot of wrong and misleading statistics from government. One example is the total value of the stock market. While the market value continues to rise to record high during the pandemic due to Federal Reserve intervention, and all these monopoly enterprises quickly surpass trillions of dollars of market value, we are still seeing growing social issues and inequality. looking at the working class in Rusty Belt. A lot of middle class people have been thrown off their feet into poverty. They can't have liberty if they can't even feed the family. This increasing homelessness people wandering the streets can't have liberty. Those who are addicted to drugs can't have liberty if they can't even control the body and mind. That's why we can't be deceived by the government and Wall Street anymore. We need to hold them accountable for the liberty of our people, not superficial rights and political correctness. The conclusion of the dark future lies before US and humanity is not drawn easily. It may seem absurd and even ridiculous at first. However, if you are patient enough and follow through the history and the philosophical evidence, you will have deeper understanding of the underlying logic. This lecture is organized step by step, and we use some key philosophical and historical concepts. At the beginning of the series, we will discuss the contemporary Chinese history and focus on how Chinese Communist Party started as a few dozen people, how it has taken over China with its guerrilla warfare from the US-supported Nationalist Party, aka KMT. Any serious discussion about history can't avoid the great philosophers like Hegel, the greatest thinker and philosopher of the 19th century, Karl Marx and Engels, who founded the Marxism, Fukuyama, the author of End of History. We will see how and why Marxist socialism as a philosophy is wrong and as a social system is a disaster. We then look at those world and today's conflict from a civilization perspective. Many civilizations have already vanished in the short period of human history of past millenniums, and the remaining Islamic, socialist and neo-totalitarianism, liberal democracies are competing for the future. In the game theory, a system can have more than two Nash equilibriums. Then the winner can be random at best. This lecture series is by no means trying to draw a conclusion for you. The critical-minded audience need to think for yourself and should have questions and counter-arguments when you are watching it. Any discussion and challenges are welcome. If necessary, I can always add extra videos to address the most common questions to this series. Before you really follow and think through all the concepts, please don't draw any conclusion rashly, as this lecture is guaranteed to be a new and fresh perspective. Just as Nobel Prize winner economist Hayek said in his book, Road to Serfdom, published during World War II, quote, all parallels between developments in different countries are, of course, deceptive. But I am not basing my arguments mainly on such parallels, nor am I arguing that these developments are inevitable. If they are, there would be no point in writing this. But till recently, there was little hope that any attempt to make them see the danger would be successful. It seems, however, as if the time was now ripe for fuller discussion of the whole issue. Unquote. Hayek's word aroused such renaissance in me, as I feel he was trying to speak for me 80 years later to US people. He moved from Nazi Germany to Britain during the World War II, and I moved from totalitarian socialism China to US. People were wise enough 80 years ago to avoid socialism in the free world. Are today's people wise enough to take the same lessons and avoid the same fate to serfdom? I know that many friends and even families can't get along because of different political views. I have my sincere hope to unite them by my theories. I've heard a few arguments and questions that is tricky and deceiving, but actually really easy to answer if you have the wisdom, some knowledge about history, and the understanding of a little philosophy. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for your support.